Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by, and welcome to the LexisNexis Risk Solutions Anti-Bribery and Corruption Law in Malaysia, the Next Phase webinar. During the presentation, all participants will be in listen-only mode. Should you wish to ask a question during the presentation, please use the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen. Please note that we'll try to get to as many questions as we can in the time that we have left at the end of today's webinar. However, if we're unable to get to your question today, someone will get back to you after the program is over. And as a reminder, this conference is being recorded. Our presenter today is Charles Thomas, Director, Anti-Bribery and Corruption, LexisNexis Risk Solutions. Charles Thomas is a subject matter expert within the anti-bribery and corruption ABC market. With over 10 years of global experience, he provides a detailed view of the pressures and problems that the ever-increasing enforcement and regulation of ABC poses to companies in all sectors. Charles is a frequent speaker at a wide range of events globally, covering a range of anti-corruption, risk management, and due diligence topics, including the UK Bribery Act, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and more. Without further ado, it's my great pleasure to turn this special session over to Charles. Charles, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chris. I also now have to leave the screen, if I may, just on a brief disclaimer, as is often the case with these things. But firstly, I'd like to thank you all for taking some time out of your afternoons to come and listen here. Certainly hope I can share some insights and information that will be of use to you. As well as the disclaimer on the screen, I'm going to add my own little mini personal disclaimer on a couple of levels, if I may. As you may be able to tell by my accent, I'm not based in Asia. I actually live and work in the UK. And you join me on the phone in the middle of a raging storm outside. So maybe some cracks and bangs of thunder and lightning. And also a potential raging storm inside as my children get ready to go for school. So if there is a scream in the back, I assure you it's nothing to worry about. As the general theme of this presentation, we wanted to touch on the changing landscape in anti-corruption regulation, specifically in Malaysia. It's a very exciting time in the anti-corruption landscape whenever there is anything new that comes about. It sounds maybe a little strange to get excited by new regulation, but certainly in our industry, in the compliance space, I feel that we all do. I was recently at a conference in America just last week, and even there were people actually talking about this change to the Malaysian law because it's a new thing and it's driving the overall process of anti-bribery and corruption regulation worldwide and helping improve it. What's coming is an update to the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, which is coming into force next year, early next year, which is really strong. It's a very powerful update, and crucially, it's an update which brings the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, excuse me, into line with other global anti-corruption regulations. I'm going to come on to it in a little bit more detail later on about how it's going to reflect and mirror and potentially work with some of the other international regulations. But this forms part of an overall global drive to harmonize laws, to harmonize regulations, which ultimately should achieve a number of things. Firstly, it should help actually stop bribery and corruption, which is the ultimate aim. That aim then delivers an improvement in overall global business conditions. It helps business be more successful without having to resort to bribery and corruption. But the other big advantage for the enforcement agencies of this harmonization project is that it's helping and contributing to an increase in cross-border enforcements. Now, if we look at some of the specifics of the update that's coming, I've tried to list a few of them out and just wanted to touch on some of the big things which are going to change. The first of those is Section 17A, Part 3, in true legal speak. Actually, one thing that is quite notable about the update to the Act that's been proposed is when you read it, it's put in very simple language. And I think that's a very, very strong, very helpful message from the Commission to anyone this applies to, because rather than putting it in language that's hidden in legal speak and lawyers' terms, it's written in language that people can actually understand. And that really helps with the communication of this to everyone involved, not just the lawyers, not just the consultants. It helps with that communication across the board, and that has to be a good thing. Section 17A3 provides for parallel prosecution of a company for any offence by the company or associated entities. So it could well be that an executive of a company is prosecuted for an offence committed by an employee, or potentially by an offence committed by an associated entity, a business partner, a sales agent, a joint venture partner. Now, there is a statutory defence for this, as with almost all cases in anti-bribery and corruption, that if a company, and obviously the senior executives, can prove that they have carried out due diligence to prevent, and actually this is a slight quote from the wording of the Act, due diligence to prevent the commission of the offence as he ought to have exercised, having regard to the nature of his function in that capacity and to the circumstances. Now, the interesting thing there is it really ties into the concept of adequate due diligence and risk-based approach, fundamentals of all other anti-bribery and corruption regulation worldwide. That's an excellent thing to have, tying that into that consistent messaging, again, making it easy to understand, but also making it easy to implement. Executives and companies have to show that they have carried out adequate due diligence into their business dealings. I want to come on back to due diligence quite a lot, but here it really ties into that risk-based approach, what's in there. That parallel prosecution can increase in terms of a financial penalty, which I'll comment on in a moment, but also it can include up to 20 years in prison. Up to 20 years in prison is a very heavy threat. And it's a very strong, powerful threat for executives who are impacted by the Malaysian Act, but they need to get their house in order because there is personal responsibility. It's no longer just an issue that the company is going to be fined and the company will be in the headlines, but there is a strong, powerful piece of personal responsibility, personal culpability tied into this Act. Now this again, looking at that harmonisation of regulations, this fits quite nicely with the way the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is moving in direction. Again, just last year I was at another conference in the US, a conference specifically on the Foreign and Corrupt Practices Act, the US regulation, and was listening to a speaker from the FBI who was helping in terms of prosecutions and investigations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And it was a fantastic presentation, brilliantly scary, but brilliantly amusing at the same time. And he said something which stuck with me wonderfully, which is he looked up from his lectern and said, "I'm a people person." And he said it with a wonderful smile. And then he said, "I love prosecuting people." And he tied in there the message that he, the FBI and the FCPA, really wanted to be going after the individuals involved and the individuals who are to blame more than the companies. And part of the reason for that is, yes, you can fine a company and that might make a difference. A company gets a $200 million fine. Well, if that company has a $200 billion turnover, it can really brush that away and it's not that much of an impact. But if the senior executive is sent to jail for 20 years, that's huge. The penalties, just to touch on those, they're also going to grow. The penalties can go to at least 10 times the value of the bribe, or 1 million in local Malaysian currency, which at the moment is around 240,000 US dollars, whichever is higher. So it's very likely that in most cases that will go to at least 10 times the value of the bribe, because that will be higher. Some of the recent cases we've seen prosecuted under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act have seen bribes totaling in the tens or hundreds of millions over a lengthy period of time. So this could well see some very, very huge fines in terms of financial fines, as well as that personal culpability. Put both of those together and you have something that really should make this Act bite. As well as those increased penalties, there's a real focus now on third parties. Third parties have always been an issue in every piece of anti-bribery and corruption regulation worldwide. Almost all of the cases brought under the FCPA, for example, have involved a third party. The UK Bribery Act cases, what few we've seen so far, have also involved third parties, and it's very normal to see that as part of the process. This Act, the update to the Malaysian Act, makes some really strong and clear definitions of what a third party is in this case. Effectively, it says that it's an offence if a person associated with a company engages in corruption on behalf of that company. And it goes on to detail associated people as including directors, employees, but also any person or business, and again, a slight quote from the text, who performs services for and on behalf of the commercial organization. So any company, any person who performs services for or on behalf of you as a business, you are not only liable you're responsible rather for training and communication to ensure that they are aware of your standards and they uphold your standards, but you're in turn responsible for any acts they commit on your behalf. Now, that is again part of that harmonization of regulations to bring it in line with others, but it also means that there is a real onus on spreading the message and spreading the compliance culture far beyond just your own company. Your compliance culture and your due diligence culture may be very strong, it may be very effective, but if you don't ensure and mandate and indeed audit that your third parties, so any person or business engaging in services on your behalf, if you don't ensure that their policies, that their culture and their process is not robust, that's going to cause equal problems for you. The final bit of really powerful update to the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission Act that's coming in is the failure to prevent. And I think it's fair to say this is an example of Malaysia cherry-picking the best bits from other regulations. And that's good. I think we can all agree that if you're going to have a regulation, it's best to try and imitate, copy, plagiarize, whatever you wish to call it, other good pieces of legislation. Most people in the anti-bribery and corruption space agree that the UK Bribery Act is a very strong, very powerful piece of regulation. I think it's fair to say it hasn't yet had the impact in terms of cases and in terms of fines and penalties that we're expecting. But most people agree it's fairly strong. And I think actually that strength is a good thing. What it's actually done though is it's taken, or the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Act rather, is taken one piece there, which is the statutory defence and the failure to prevent combined, brought them into the Act, and that really helps. If you have adequate procedures, and again, I'm just going to read from the text of the update. If a company had in place adequate procedures designed to prevent persons associated with the commercial organisation from undertaking such conduct. Now, those adequate procedures in the UK Bribery Act, I'm going to come on to those in a little while, but if you have a good due diligence program in place that ensures you know who you're doing business with and can prove it, if you have a good training program in place that ensures that your employees and third parties know what to do and when to do it, all of those things together can come to form that statutory defence that you have not failed to prevent. Now, failure to prevent has one other interesting update, which I'm about to come on to on the next slide, in France. But the piece that acts in Malaysia is a really good piece of regulations coming into place, which is going to have a strong impact on how companies ensure that they have a good program in place. Vital. What I wanted to touch on that next is some of the international laws. I've talked a lot about harmonization and bringing things in line. I think it's fairly good at this point to look at what other laws are out there. Now, I've cherry-picked a few just to show, and the reason I've cherry-picked a few is they're either the biggest under the FCPA, potentially the most powerful under the UK Bribery Act, potentially the most interesting under SAP-2 in France, and then the most fresh and recent in the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission updates. If we start with the US FCPA, the US FCPA is a hugely powerful, brilliant piece of regulation at cutting down on the bribery of foreign public officials. So it makes it illegal, an illegal act to pay a bribe to a foreign public official or an instrumentality of state. And that's very powerful. I think, as we've all seen, it's the act that gets the headlines. It's the act that brings in the big money. To use an American expression, it's the big dog in the fight. But I think that's fair to say it's there. It's the most established, it's the most powerful, and it's got the most resources behind it. It has a few areas where potentially it doesn't quite go far enough, though, I think. If you looked at the bribery of a foreign public official as an act, that in itself is a bad thing. I think we can all agree. However, it only prosecutes and only makes illegal the paying of a bribe to a foreign public official. It includes particular carve-outs, what are called facilitation payments in the US. I think facilitation payments can be a grey area, but providing you as a company have carried out adequate due diligence and have your books and records, and those two terms, due diligence, books and records, those are two terms that are really common across the board. Wherever you are impacted by regulation, that's across the board. And then also the training communication piece. So the US Act, very powerful, very strong, very established, and continuing to hit really hard. The UK Bribery Act builds upon what's in the FCPA, and I think it's fair to say makes a stronger law for combating bribery and corruption. The first difference is it makes no distinction between the payer or the recipient of a bribe. So paying a bribe is illegal under the UK Bribery Act. Receiving a bribe is also illegal under the UK Bribery Act. Now, some have said that prosecuting both sides is unfair because the recipient of a bribe may be a low-paid worker in a low-value economy. I think that's a fair criticism. However, both sides are culpable because in many cases the bribe recipient is the person asking for a bribe, is the person requesting the bribe, and they're in that case equally culpable. The other area where it makes a big difference, a big change, is that it makes no distinction between the bribery of a foreign public official or an instrumentality of state or a private individual. So state and private are not differentiated under the UK Bribery Act. They're both considered bad. That gives it a broader reach. It should, as things begin to develop and as it begins to bite and have some real power in the marketplace, it should provide more of a level playing field for all companies involved. That's the aim. It's not looking to penalise UK companies or non-UK companies. The real aim is to try and level that playing field and ultimately stop bribery and corruption. The UK Bribery Act very conveniently has 6 principles, which I've listed here as well. And these 6 principles are probably the most important takeaways of what to do to get your anti-bribery and corruption program right. As in, if you're following these 6 principles, chances are you're doing okay. The first of those is due diligence. Due diligence is a fundamental to any risk-based approach in anti-bribery and corruption, supply chain onboarding, know your customer. All of those particular functions, due diligence is essential, and it's essential to the UK Bribery Act. So also is carrying out a risk assessment. And the term risk-based approach is, yes, it's used a lot, and I almost want to punch myself every time I use it because I'm trying to find a different way of saying it. There's no different way of saying it. It is an important part, having that risk-based approach. So knowing what risks you face and therefore dealing with them accordingly. The UK Bribery Act also focuses on monitoring and review. So it's not enough just to have a program and leave it. It's also not enough just to have a due diligence check carried out on a new third party and leave it. You need to continually monitor and review what's in your relationships. Training and communication, obviously vital, and that does come into the Malaysia Act as well. The vitality of that is its communication not only to your business, but to third parties acting on your behalf. Within the UK Bribery Act, there's also a very clever piece of what's called proportionality. There's no expectation under the UK Bribery Act that you will carry out the same level of due diligence on every relationship. You do need to carry out some due diligence on every business relationship, but that needs to be proportionate to the risk of doing business. So if you are looking at a provider of flowers for your head office's front desk at reception, that's a very low risk industry. So yes, you need to carry out some due diligence. Are they who they say they are? Can they deliver the flowers? That's important. If you're an oil and gas company working in offshore drilling on the west coast of Africa, the chances are your suppliers are going to be much higher risk. Therefore, you may need to do more due diligence and more investigation there. It's being British, I have to praise this law, but it's just beautiful common sense. It's applying common sense to a compliance process. A wonderful thing. There's then the failure to prevent law, which is something that the FCPA doesn't necessarily have as a specific offence. It can be brought in other areas, but failure to prevent in itself is a strong piece of regulation to make sure that companies have a good policy in place. If we move then to Sapin 2, Sapin 2 is one of the most recent. Sapin is the name of the politician who brought the law in, and 2, for those that don't speak French, is 2, so it's his second law, Sapin 2. In many ways, it mirrors all of the functions of both the FCPA and the UK Bribery Act. Much like the Malaysian law, it only really applies to French companies, in that it applies to French companies of a certain size and a certain number of employees. But it has one thing which stands out, well, the two things, I think, which stand out above and beyond the UK Bribery Act. And when I talked about the Malaysian law cherry-picking the best bits, it feels very much as if Malaysia has picked some of these best bits, but these two pieces, I think, are the next best bits, which may be incorporated into future updates to the Malaysian Act, future updates to anti-corruption laws in Singapore, in Indonesia, wherever else. I think they're wonderful. One of those is the mandatory policy, and that is that a company has to have a documented policy of what you do, what your compliance process is. It has to be there and documented. Fairly obvious, but if you don't have one, that is an offence. Even if no bribe has been paid or received, a lack of policy is an offence. They also have, I think, my favourite piece of law that's recently come out anywhere in the world, a proactive process of auditing that policy. The Agence Française Anticorruption, the French anti-corruption agency, have the rights and the power to turn up at your door first thing in the morning, knock on the door and demand to see your policies and procedures. They can then look at those policies and procedures, and if they decide that they are not sufficient, again, even if there is no crime committed, you can be prosecuted. So those two pieces there basically mean you have to have the policy in place, and you can be in trouble if you don't. I think my favorite example of that was Enron, the famous company that collapsed some years ago. Enron actually had one of the best corporate ethics and compliance policies in the world. They just failed to act on it. This piece here, France, the French law, would actually go in, audit that proactively, and spot the problems. If we look at the column now for the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Act, what you can see is it takes all of those best bits and bundles them together. Going back to that area of harmonisation, it really brings it together and makes it more of a level playing field across the board for all participants. In this case, primarily focusing on Malaysian businesses, Malaysian citizens and residents. It brings in all the bits together and makes that work more effectively. And this is very much in line with guidance from the OECD, who've been working tirelessly to try and improve anti-bribery and corruption law worldwide. It also ties in with, if we're looking at the Asia-Pacific region and beyond, it ties in with an upcoming law change in Australia that really, again, brings the Australian law very much in line with everything else. I think the key takeaway from this slide is how powerful it is that Malaysia is bringing itself in line with others. Malaysia is not going to be lagging behind in terms of their anti-bribery and corruption law. If anything, they're moving ahead and getting further onto the board. That can only be a good thing for Malaysian business, but also business in the region. The interesting thing about compliance, however, is it's not just your own compliance regime you have to be concerned about. If we looked at the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Act, so a Malaysian business has to comply with that. And that's a good thing. However, there are always going to be local equivalents. As I showed on the previous slide, there are going to be the French Act, Sapin 2, there are acts in Australia, there's acts in China, there's laws in Germany. Wherever you are carrying out business, you will have to comply not only with your home law, but also with the local equivalents. Now, those global operations, if you operate in multiple locations, mean you're going to have varying requirements, varying laws you have to comply with. The only way to ensure that you're covered is to look for the highest common denominator. Ensure that you have the highest possible standards in all of the locations that you operate, and then apply those standards across the board. One way of looking at this, an interesting analogy, is to look at the oil and gas sector. The oil and gas sector, if you visit a company who work in offshore drilling, they have the same safety standards and briefing when you go to their front office as they do if you were going onto an offshore drilling rig. They apply the highest common denominator of safety and security to an office in St James's Square in the centre of London as they do to an oil rig off the coast of Nigeria. That is applying the highest common denominator. I think we can do the same here with compliance. There's then an increased appetite and demand and interest and concern on the issue of slavery and human trafficking. California, anyone who trades with California in any way will fall under the California Transparency and Supply Chains Act, which helps prevent slavery and trafficking. But there's then further acts. The UK has brought out a good act recently, a very good law, which misleadingly is called the Modern Slavery Act. This is a personal bugbear, and we go back to that. The opinions may not reflect. There's nothing modern about slavery, and I think it's very misleading to call it a modern act. Slavery is medieval. Slavery is beyond medieval. I could go on a rant, but I'm going to choose not to. However, these acts are really beginning to help people clamp down on slavery and child trafficking and forced labor within their workforces. That's also looking at possibly the bottom comment here of corporate social responsibility. If you as a business operate using slave labor, and that gets onto the front pages of the newspaper, that's your reputation shot. We're also seeing an increased focus on corporates for sanctions and enforcement. OFAC have recently released some new guidance on sanctions compliance for non-bank entities. Obviously, most banks are pretty up to speed on this, and they're aware of their responsibilities and aware of what to do. But outside of the banking sector, we're seeing maybe it's not the case. We've actually recently published a white paper on the OFAC guidance in the US, and it's an increased area of focus. It's going to be an increased area of prosecution as well as we move forward. There's then also the conflict minerals issue, often coming up, the blood diamonds and conflict minerals within mobile phone batteries. That's going to continue to rumble in the background, possibly tied into that slavery and human trafficking law. If we take all of those factors together, so all the different pieces of regulation, all the different processes, and bring them into building a compliance program, there's certain areas that are going to be foundational, that you have to do, and certain areas that you might want to make sure are tight and in place. The biggest foundation of all of these is that risk assessment. And I think looking at the UK Bribery Act, where it talks about proportionality, looking at the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Act, where it makes it clear that you have to know who you're doing business with and know what the risks are, having a risk assessment process in place allows you to build an effective compliance program. That then has to be documented, but also implemented. Back to Enron, they documented it, but didn't implement it. Under the French law, you have to not only document your process, but implement it. And under the Malaysian updates that are due to come into place, you have to make sure you have not failed to prevent. So that's implementing your program. A layer across the board that has to be in place to comply with anything, particularly with the Malaysian Act, is due diligence. So that's due diligence on any third party or any business or any person carrying out work on your behalf. You will need to be able to show that you have at least done some due diligence on all third parties. Now, that due diligence is not a static process. Yes, it needs to be done at onboarding, but crucially, it needs to form part of an ongoing monitoring process. And that's an area where it can become a difficult issue and a difficult process, particularly if you are a large entity with many, many third parties. If you only have 2 suppliers, then your life is quite easy. You can do the due diligence quite regularly. If you have 2,000 suppliers, that becomes a little bit more tricky. If you have 20 or 30 or 40,000 suppliers, you need to look for a way of automating that process and automating it effectively and efficiently. What we have found also is within the corporate world, not necessarily within the financial world, we found within the corporate world, compliance resources are woefully underfunded and under-resourced. So there's a real struggle to get the work done. There has to be a process of reporting, suspicious matter reporting. This is very much in line with banking processes for anti-money laundering. The idea of flagging an issue and reporting it appropriately. Many of the laws that we've discussed here make provisions and make allowances and improve your possibility if you report accurately. There's one very famous case of Morgan Stanley in China who identified an individual paying a bribe on their behalf. They reported it immediately. They were able to show that that individual had been trained, had received appropriate communication, that they had done sufficient due diligence. So their SMR, Suspicious Matter Reporting document, really put together absolutely everything that made the case that the company were not to blame. It was an individual. They put that forward. The authorities decided that yes, the individual was to blame, and no, the company was not to blame. The company was exonerated, had a complete declination. There was no fine brought against them. And a month later, the head of compliance of the company was on the front page of Forbes magazine with the title, "The Most Marketable Compliance Officer in the World." He did quite well for himself out of it, but crucially, the company did very well by reporting it appropriately. And then we go back to monitoring, and I think monitoring is vital. That monitoring isn't just monitoring of the due diligence, it's monitoring of this whole cycle, the whole compliance process. I couldn't really fit it on the slide because I'm not the best person in the world at putting PowerPoint together, but effectively this should really be a circle. But it's a circle at which all points can go back to each other. They can all meet in the middle, they can all cross at each other, that you have to go back and do things. If you find an issue with your due diligence, that issue needs to be reported appropriately as part of your suspicious matter reporting. But that issue might affect your risk assessment of that relationship, which might change your program and your documentation, which might change the way that you monitor that relationship, which might change the way you review your entire process. So it has to be part of a circle. But if you bring all of this together, you can really begin to build a compliance program into something that can help. Before you get to that point, though, there's a few barriers, a few issues to get across. The pressure on compliance functions are changing. One of those pressures is the high volume of third parties. Now, under the Malaysian Act amendments that are coming into force, that responsibility to train, document, mandate processes to your third parties is ever growing. That responsibility also lies on you as a company to carry out due diligence on all of those third parties. So those third parties may be upstream, they may be suppliers, they may be raw material companies coming into your way, there may also be someone who's coming in as a customer. There may be a third party in terms of being an employee, a director of a joint venture partner. That volume is going to make a big change. One thing we're also seeing is the movement of money globally at the moment. If you look at the global socio-political landscape, there is a lot of money moving from one country to another. Every time that happens, investment, moving in, investment is good, and we all like and we all want investment in our marketplaces. But that can make an issue. That can potentially pose risk. Where is that money coming from? Who does it belong to? Can we be sure that we're having investments from the right places? Compliance is also often seen as a cost center. Oh, you guys just soak up the money. You don't really make anything. You're just there. You're a barrier to business is another one that we hear a lot. I once heard somebody jokingly refer to compliance as the department of no, as in no, you can't do that. That's a problem internally. That's a problem which can be solved, and I want to touch on some of the benefits in a moment. One of the other big issues around those multiple regimes is looking at there are lots of different regimes you have to comply with, but how can we find a way to actually make it all work in your benefit? I think if we can focus on the core efforts and on the core things that a compliance process needs to do, and those are effectively listed here, and these come all the way from the 6 principles of the UK Bribery Act, they come from the guidance of the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission amendments, they come from the FCPA guidance notes, they're in all of these pieces here, that they really do focus on these pieces. If a compliance process focuses on training, on due diligence, on making sure there's a good books and records trail, on making sure there's a baseline standard that everyone knows they have to live up to. Now that baseline doesn't mean the lowest common denominator. Again, going back to that comparison slide, we're very much looking here at the highest common denominator. If we can do that, implement a global but also local approach so that, yes, there's the highest common denominator approach, but also it's sympathetic to the culture, the work ethic, and standards locally, then compliance can actually become a benefit. It can become something positive and become something good. As a Latin scholar in my youth, I'm duty bound to include at least one Latin quote in every presentation I give, so I make no apologies for this. Scientia potentia est, loosely translates as knowledge is power. And knowledge is power. Knowledge is something that's really useful. And a due diligence process, carrying out an effective baseline, highest common denominator due diligence process on your third parties, provides you as a business with knowledge. That knowledge is information that's hugely valuable about the people and the companies that you're working with. You can use that information to engender better relationships, stronger relationships, a better understanding of who your suppliers are. You can also potentially even use it to work on negotiations for price and service. The more you know about a business, the more you can use to your advantage. So all that knowledge, one of the worst things that can be done is take that knowledge from a due diligence process and silo it away in a compliance file marked yes or no. Take that information out, use it, develop it. It could be competitors, it could be peers, it could be suppliers, but every piece of information that comes from that process can be hugely powerful. When we look at all the different regimes that you have to comply with, the Malaysian Act is something that every Malaysian company will have to comply with. That process needs to be in place. That process needs to be solid. But you can also, under that same process of not failing to prevent bribery and corruption for the Malaysian Act, you can also almost certainly focus on not failing to prevent for the UK Bribery Act if you're also impacted by that. You could also focus on your corporate social responsibility and ethical supply chain screening process in the same process. So rather than having multiple, again, silos of, well, our supply chain guys do this piece, our compliance guys do this piece, and our corporate social responsibility guys do this piece, you can actually roll that together into a single automated process, a single consolidated process, which will get better information sharing. Information is power, but also fewer processes means not only are you going to get better results, but you're actually going to have less work to do. I think it's crucial to say, though, that in this space, compliance with all of these acts I've been discussing, if you have the best compliance program against the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Act, or in line with rather than against the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Act, that is really only prevention. You have to make sure that you have that in place, however, because it's your business relationship that's on the line, and it's your business relationship which will suffer if there was going to be a failure or a problem. We found recently an example of a construction company who said that they were finding it very difficult to hire staff, and the reason they were finding it difficult to hire staff is because their industry was seen as corrupt. Not because they themselves as a company were corrupt, which they weren't, but their industry was seen as corrupt, and people did not want to work for their industry. As the boom in millennial workers continues, I feel very old saying millennials. I hope I'm not that old. Millennials, there are many surveys out there that millennials are not only willing to pay more for ethically produced goods, so goods with a good compliance process, they're also willing, strangely, to accept a lower salary to work for what they see to be a good company. Now, compliance is part of being a good company. That translates into many places. We're seeing a growth in Chinese companies looking to be compliant with not only their local laws, but also compliant with global laws as a competitive edge. So they're using it to strengthen their reputation. We are the most compliant company, therefore we're better to do business with. That's got to be a good development. So those reputations, they can be really powerful in your advantage, but if you're the one that gets it wrong, that reputation is easily lost. The UK Bribery Act has yet to have a very significant large case. It's certain that the first company that is prosecuted in a big way is going to make huge headlines, negative headlines worldwide. And that is also true of the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Act, Anti-Corruption Commission Act, rather. When they find, so when this law is brought into place and they are able to prosecute a company under this law, that's going to be very big news. And that big news will not just be in Malaysia. It will ring far further around the world. Now, I wanted to touch on a little bit of an odd bit to end. It's a little bit of a personal note. I live in a small village out in the countryside west of London. I recently moved out of the village into an even smaller village, I suppose is the best way to put it, and that meant changing pubs. Now, changing pubs in the UK is a big thing. When I changed pubs, I walked in and met a friend of mine for a drink, and he introduced me to a friend of his, someone I'd never met, and this guy said, "What do you do for a living?" And I found it very difficult to explain. So I thought of a case of, well, why does it matter? And the reason why what we're doing matters, and that's all of us on this call in this compliance space, is I'm going to use an example. And that example is Mr. Teodorin Obiang. Teodorin Obiang is the son of the president of Equatorial Guinea. And I use him as an example for a number of reasons. One of those reasons is to show his taste in cars. For anyone who follows cars or knows anything about cars, these are all quite special motor cars on here. This guy had some pretty special taste in cars, as you can see. There's also a lot of money there. There are 2 Bugatti Veyrons just on this particular trailer here. There's a Rolls Royce. There's a Maserati MC12. Perhaps most upsettingly for me, the red car on the front is a works-tuned Aston Martin V600 Le Mans. There are only about 49 of those in the world, and I want one desperately. This is the wrong colour, but we'll excuse him that. So again, if we look here on this, just on this loader, there's millions of dollars worth of cars. He also had, let's be honest, quite a nice yacht. He also had quite a nice house. This is one of his houses, I should say. This is his house in Malibu. He also had houses in Paris, where the cars were seized from when he was caught, effectively, for being involved in bribery and corruption. When we talk about what this actually means, his job within the government of Equatorial Guinea was Agriculture and Forestry Minister. He liked to jokingly refer to himself as the Minister for Cutting Down Trees. His salary, and I'd just like you to keep in mind the cars, the yachts, the houses, the flash suits. His salary was approximately $99,000 US, in the region of £74,000. Really quite a scarily low salary when looking at what this individual has or had. So why does it matter that one guy there who doesn't earn much money has all of this? Well, where did that money come from? Equatorial Guinea is, well, poverty is endemic in Equatorial Guinea. It has the highest per capita income in Africa, which is quite an interesting statistic. So per capita, Equatorial Guinea has more money than anywhere else. However, 2/3 of the population live on less than $1 US per day. Only 41% of the population in the populated areas, so that's in the towns, have access to clean drinking water. Life expectancy, infant mortality are way below average for sub-Saharan Africa. The UN Human Development Index scored at 144 out of 187. That's pretty near the bottom of human development quality. So all of the money which went into Mr. Obiang's bank account and bought that house in Malibu, bought that yacht, bought that Aston Martin, all of that money was diverted from somewhere. And it was diverted from genuine business development. So people coming in, and yes, forestry is a legitimate business, but rather than investing their money in ethically sourced forestry and ensuring that they're not paying bribes, those bribes must have been going somewhere. Rather than investing in what else was out there, those bribes are going somewhere. This is the reality of life for the majority of people in Equatorial Guinea. A school with a dirt floor, no windows, no air conditioning, certainly no luxury yacht. So if we took one little thing about what we do is within the compliance space, ultimately, we're about making it better for people. We're about making it there. So when I was in my pub talking to this chap I've now met, who's since become a good friend of mine, I was able to say that actually I help make the world just a little bit better. Just to lead on to those final pieces, I think it's worth saying this isn't just about Malaysia. It isn't just about the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission Act. I mean, okay, it sort of is. I think that's fair to say. It sort of is just about Malaysia. But if we look at the actual law and the act itself, it applies to citizens and residents when they are outside of Malaysia as well. Now, given the fluidity of population, the movement of people in a region, it's unlikely that there will be a company that's immune to this law. It's unlikely to find that's going to be in there. It also helps bring Malaysia really in line with other laws, such as the UK Bribery Act, such as the FCPA, such as Sapanda, the Australian Act. Now, it might be a surprise that I've got this far through a presentation talking about Malaysia, talking about bribery and corruption. I've got this far before I've mentioned 1MDB. And I'm only going to mention it very briefly. I think it's fair to say 1MDB has been covered in so much depth already that I think people are probably beginning to get a little bit of 1MDB fatigue reading about it. However, what it means globally is that scandal is going to drive increased interest, scrutiny, and enforcement efforts on both Malaysia and the Asia-Pacific region overall. It's well documented or well known that when the FCPA, for example, bring an enforcement against one company in a region, they may look at others in the same region. When they bring one company in the region in an industry, they'll look at those as well. It's going to make things harder, and it's also going to mean there's potential for multiple cross-border investigations and enforcement, which we've already seen with 1MDB. We've seen with other cases. There was a case with an aviation company who had enforcements brought by the US, the UK, Indonesia, and Brazil. Those cross-border enforcements are ever increasing. Malaysia bringing its laws in line with other countries is going to help Malaysia join in that global enforcement action. I talked about the global enforcement business. Maybe that's me being a bit flippant, but I think it's fair to say this is now seen as a global fight against anti-bribery and corruption. Malaysia is bringing itself right into the forefront of that fight. However, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to do too much. You can make the process work for you. As I touched on, if you have compliance stopping it being a burden and turning it into a benefit, focus on the information you bring in, focus on simplification of process to provide better insights, form better relationships, and also protect your reputation, the compliance process can really work for you and make life better. Ultimately, if I was going to leave one takeaway for this, looking at the list of people joining in, looking at what I do for a living, it is actually about making a difference. And I think there's something we can feel very proud about as an industry in the compliance space, that leveling that playing field, Malaysia bringing in this law that strengthens and tightens and will cut down on bribery, will cut down on corruption. Cutting down on bribery and corruption will ensure that the money that's going into a country, into a business, that investment goes where it's needed. It goes into economic development. It doesn't go into personal development of one or two corrupt people. It goes into economic development. And that economic development is going to help drive financial inclusivity. It's going to help drive financial transparency. It's going to bring more people into work. It's going to bring more people into education, more people into having healthcare. I think we should be proud of that, and we should all be shouting that from the rooftops. Compliance isn't a bad thing. Malaysia having much stricter laws coming in place is a really good thing, both for Malaysia, but also for the region, but also for all of those of us in the compliance space. So with that, I'm just going to hand back, hopefully, and have some questions. I've left my contact details here if anyone does want to get in touch with me. As mentioned, I am based in the UK, but invariably up at very early hours in the morning speaking with Australia and very late hours in the morning speaking with California. But with that, I'd like to hopefully hand over and see if there are any questions to take.
All right. Thank you, Charles, for a great presentation. We have come to the end of the presentation. Have a few minutes for questions. First, as a reminder to you, we're going to go ahead and put up a poll, and we'd like you to go ahead and respond to the poll. And this is just so that you can further carry on the conversation. So we'd be delighted to continue the conversation with you. Please indicate the following in the following poll when you would like to be contacted so that we may answer any questions that you might have. And your answers here can be within a week, in 2 weeks, in a month, or in 2 months. Just click on the radio button next to the answer that's appropriate for you, and then click the submit button. We'll leave that up during our Q&A, and then we will go ahead and get to some questions right now for Charles. Charles, we've got several coming in here. Let's go with our first one here. With the corporate liability provisions from the new ABC law in Malaysia, do you think that this will lead to cessation of business partner relationships as the top decision makers feel that they are at stake if things go wrong?
Yeah, I think it's something that might well happen. Now, in the banking sector, it's often referred to as de-risking, taking risk out of a portfolio. It's very likely that as more companies tighten up and strengthen their due diligence process, they are likely to identify business partners who no longer meet the standards that company wants, the standards that company needs. It could well be that actually bringing in this process, bringing in a tighter, more effective due diligence process identifies a company you've been working with for 5 years who you thought was fantastic actually turns out to be employing slave labor in Vietnam. That's going to mean you're going to get rid of that business partner. So yes, I think it is likely there will be some cessation of business partners. Not quite going to take the same process of de-risking within banks, but I think we will see increased due diligence will give more scrutiny. More scrutiny gives more information, and ultimately some of that information will be negative and will lead to an end of a relationship.
All right, thank you, Charles. And as a reminder, to ask a question, just go ahead and click on the Q&A icon, type your question in, click the submit button. We'll get to as many as we can in the time that we have left. With that, let's move on to another question here for Charles. Charles, it says we're engaged in a lot of cross-border transactions with varied cultural business behaviors. These present unique risks and misrepresentation of the ABC regulations. So how do you suggest we work around these limitations?
I think that the varied cultural issue is one that often comes up. During the life of the FCPA, it's been criticized for being a sort of colonial enforcement, almost like a colonialism by law. And arguably, there is some sort of imposing standards piece there. Certainly not colonialism by law. That's a bit of hyperbole. But it's fair to say there are going to be problems and issues with multiple cultures and multiple processes. It comes back to that highest common denominator piece. Your standards have to hold up against the most likely enforcement you are going to face. So if you're a Malaysian company, once this new update to the Act comes into place, you are going to have to show that regardless of the varied cultures you deal with, you as a business adhered to the standards required of you. Now, in some cases, that may lead to difficult business decisions. In some cases, it may mean that you feel you're unable to carry out a business relationship. In some cases, it means you have to walk away from a transaction. If it means you have to walk away from a transaction, so be it. Because hopefully, the reason for walking away is because that transaction posed a much higher risk of bribery, a much higher risk of corruption, and therefore a much higher risk of prosecution. As we look now at that issue of personal liability as well as corporate liability, the onus really is on making sure you're making the right business decision. In no way do these acts stop cross-border transactions. In no way do these acts stop cross-cultural or cross-national interaction. If anything, we're seeing now the harmonization of these laws helping every country, and therefore every business within every country, realize that they have an obligation to sit to those higher standards. So hopefully, and I think Malaysia, with Sepanda recently coming on board and passing into law, with Malaysia passing this act into law, we're seeing more and more countries doing this. Malaysia taking a lead within the Asia-Pacific region is a big message to everyone else that doesn't matter about varied cultural businesses, bribery and corruption is a bad thing, which is dragging down global business. So it sounds a bit as if I'm saying, never mind your different cultures. Different cultures are fine. Breaking the law is not. And these acts help companies globally ensure that they are doing better, stronger business.
All right. Thank you, Charles. Looks like we have time for just one more question. Our final question for you, Charles. What is the greatest misconception that companies and businesses have regarding ABC compliance?
I think I'm going to come up with two great misconceptions, if I may. I'm going to slightly be a politician and change my answer according to what I wanted to give. But I think it's fair to say there are two big misconceptions. The first of those goes back to that issue of the Department of No. There's a real misconception that compliance is a negative. Compliance is something that just stops you doing business. Or we can't engage with this third party. Compliance says no. Well, that's not the case. If compliance is saying no, it's saying no for a reason. And it's saying no for a reason that actually that's a bad business relationship. Don't get into it. That's one big misconception. People think that doing compliance is a barrier to business. The second one, and I'm going to use an example from Australia to illustrate this. The second one is almost willful misinterpretation of what a bribe actually is. There's a lot of fear, and that a misconception translates into fear, about gifts, travel, and entertainment within the anti-bribery and corruption space. A lot of companies bring things in that just don't make sense. An example I want to give is a recent meeting in Australia. It was about a year and a half ago, I think now. Couldn't find a meeting room with the client. Went to meet a client. He couldn't find a meeting room. He said, let's go and have a coffee outside. So we walked down into a square in the centre of Sydney. Beautiful sunny day. Obviously coffee culture in Australia, very big. We got to the little coffee shop. So I reached into my pocket, pulled out my wallet, got ready to pay and said, so what would you have? And he looked at me and said, no, I can't accept that. I can't accept a coffee. I slightly blanked and said, what? Why? He said, well, it could be seen as a bribe. I had to say, well, you do know the industry I work in. I know this space. And he said, yes, but our company will not let us accept a coffee. This was a $4 or $5 coffee. So we each bought our coffee separately. We each claimed our receipts separately so we could claim our expenses separately. That's wrong. This whole process of anti-bribery and corruption does not stop you engaging in good business practice. Good business practice is buying a client a coffee. It's taking a supplier out for lunch. It doesn't stop any of that. What it does is it imposes real common sense approaches on things. Buying someone a coffee is not a bribe. Buying someone a coffee is a decent human gesture. It's polite. Flying someone to Jamaica to sample the rather excellent Blue Mountain coffee that they grow there and have a couple of days on the beach, that's different. Everyone knows that that's a bribe. Everyone knows what's wrong. So I think there's a real misconception that you can't do business with anyone, you can't take someone out for lunch, you can't engage in any supplier because compliance says no. And it was when the UK Bribery Act came out, there was a real fear that it was going to stop any corporate hospitality. It hasn't. All it does is it just means you have to take a sensible approach. And that sensible approach comes down to common sense. You and everyone in your business knows, and because you will have trained them and communicated to them, they know what a bribe is and what a bribe isn't. And all of these new laws coming into place are just going to help cement that in people's minds, hopefully. It doesn't stop business, it really just helps business.
All right, well, thank you, Charles. That was a great presentation, and thank you for the Q&A. That is all the time that we have for questions for today. Once again, if we did not get to your question today, someone will get back to you after the program is over. My thanks to Charles Thomas for his great presentation and Q&A session. Ladies and gentlemen, this does conclude our webinar for today. We thank you for your participation and ask you to please log out of your computers.